Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast. Today, we are going to engage in a conversation that I've been nervous to have, and that's how we're formed by the news. And the reason I've been nervous to have that conversation is because who you bring on to have that conversation is in and of itself a choice, and that choice says a lot. Well, I've been praying, and the Lord, I believe, has sent me the perfect person. Kelsey Reed hosts a Concurrently podcast over at World News, and I can't recommend that podcast enough. It's fantastic. We'll link it in the show notes below. But she calls herself a professional learner, and I think that's really true. I would argue that she's probably one of the most thoughtful people I've ever had the pleasure of speaking with. She thinks and weighs her words and challenges me to do the same. So I can't wait to share my conversation with Kelsey Reed with all of you about how we are formed to be more or less like Jesus by the news. So welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Kelsey, thanks for being on the Living Room Disciple podcast today.
What a joy. It's so good to be here. I enjoy chatting with you.
Dude, I'm stoked to, we talked a few times and it's a blessing, and recording it is just a joy. In fact, I literally just hit the record button because we were having a conversation and I was like, I want to stop. I want to record this. And you were telling me a little bit. So you head up a podcast called Concurrently over at World News.
That's right.
And you were kind of telling me the story of how you got there a little bit. And you use this term that you're a professional learner, which I actually think is really important. So tell me a little bit about how a professional learner ends up hosting a podcast at a news organization.
So I'm going to have to dig a little bit deep in order to begin, because that's part of what comes with the territory of years at this point. So I'm middle-aged. But back when I was in college, my dad handed me the application for one of the very first World Journalism Institute classes. They have like 2-week courses where you get worldview training, you get some writing training, how to do features, how to write the news. And I was like Jonah in the Jesus Storybook Bible. One ticket to not Nineveh, please.
To anywhere else.
That's
Goodbye.
Exactly right.
I don't want to be at World. I want to be anywhere else.
That's right. I don't want to be at World. I want to be out in the world. In fact, I'm a MK. So when I was young, my parents were overseas in Dublin, Ireland, and
missionary kid. It took a
right.
moment to figure out what MK meant.
That's right. So pastor's kid, missionary kid, and I was kind of the reversal of the Jonah story. I wanted to get back onto the mission field. I did not want to get into journalism. The news was not my cup of tea. In fact, I have a news junkie for a mom. And I think that's part of why I was like, I'm out. That is not me. But what I do love, and what I did love even then, was I just loved to learn about everything I could in the world. And I was one of those liberal arts majors who could just not find one area to perfect. I had to do multiple languages, a good portion of history. I love literature. Loved getting that taste of art and film in order to, crunch on it and think about why are the certain details used that are used in these areas? What makes a good poem? Why does it convey what it does? So it was all about a diversity of media, a diversity of cultural forms. I am one of those gourmands. Like I love culture. I love to just consume and think about it. So that's that professional learner. I'm excited about getting a chance to see the diversity of the Lord's world and of his people, his culture makers that he has created. So that was more what made me tick. So now here I am at World. It was not what I expected, but it makes sense now because of that hunger to understand the world and to try to help others make sense of the world. But I am one of those that is in the news, but not of the news, I might say.
Which is actually really interesting, right? Because, World News, you're not a reporter over at World News, right? And so you're in this organization, but you honestly, you lead a podcast that is the language I would put to it, and you tell me if you think I'm right or wrong here, is it's kind of focused on formation and focused on the formation of the listener and focused on spiritual formation in general. Specifically, I think, just from the limited amount that I've listened, kind of helping us process the culture that you've been processing for some time now, and being able to, I just want to just put words to it if you haven't thought of it this way, to take what the Lord has been doing in your spirit and mind for some time and use it here on this podcast. Because when I'm listening, I'm sitting here thinking, you and your host, but like, Kelsey, you are thoughtful. And, it seems that the conclusions that you come to are, in a sense, hard fought cognitively. And I think there's like a lot to be honored there.
Well, just thank you for the very astute listening you've taken in and gotten.
Stop it.
Well, it is definitely what we're trying to do. So if it is coming across that way clearly enough for you to be able to iterate so well, then yes, I'm so thrilled, so thankful to hear that it is transferring into your space and hopefully into the space of many listeners. It is a hard one. It is one of those situations where there are so many different things that we're trying to tie together. Our own spiritual formation, transparently, vulnerably modeling where we are in our walk for the sake of encouraging others in their walk and in their, I pray, faithful engagement of this world. And having been a missionary kid, having attended secular university, there was so much steeping in many different worldviews, much of them humanistic, secular, splintering of those conclusions that really are godless. And I promise that this does track back to the news.
Okay, I'm ready.
But we are looking at the myriad ways that we talk about this world as human beings. And so many of those are godless representations of this world. And so being steeped in some of that thinking as a young person and having to sort through those and to see, wait a minute, what does the Lord say about his world? What does he say about man? What does he say about himself? Listening currently to The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. What does the Lord say about suffering? That is everywhere in the news.
Yeah.
And many newscasters really don't know what to do with suffering. And I would say our day and age is very much trying, again, a new way of stamping out those things, those inequalities, as Rousseau might argue, that people would argue is the cause of suffering, right? So yes, many, many details all there right now.
And I actually want to use that as a jumping off point and kind of frame why I wanted to bring you on and what kind of conversation I want to have. So the news feels on one level like it's toxic. And I don't think it's, I think in many ways the news is essentially neutral to some extent, but our engagement with it may be toxic. And the reason I bring that up is it was January of 2023, I think. I decided I was going to fast from a few things to kind of start the new year. And one of those things was the news. And I would never have self-identified, but now I can reflect on say that I was fairly much a news junkie for probably the past 4 to 5 years. News on my phone, probably read 3 to 4 articles a day, that kind of thing. And so I started that fast, and it was supposed to last a month. And I haven't broken the fast yet. And what I noticed is in my own spirit, I was becoming more peaceful. I was becoming less anxious. I was more engaged and present in my own home.
Sure.
I can't imagine the things that I probably missed out on to some extent, in those years, which were formative for some of my kids to really not be, I don't want to give the impression that I was a fully disengaged father or anything, but there wasn't 100% of fill in the home when I had my phone in my hand and I was doing what I thought was my part to be an informed citizen and develop informed things. And, to be fair, I would use what I was learning or understanding about current events to then talk to people and help connect those things to the kingdom of God. And I felt like it was this necessary thing I needed to do. Mm-hmm. And for me, I just had this moment where I realized, in that fast, that Kelsey, I was not healthy in the way that I was engaging with the news. And so I've been exploring that for about a year. And I don't think I've really come to really a place that I feel like I can educate or teach others. Like, where are we supposed to be? And so then I'm listening to you on the Concurrently podcast, which I can't recommend enough. And I feel like you use that phrase, in the news, but not of the news.
Yes.
And I think that needs to be something that is more understood in the church today. And gosh, I need help doing it. So really, this is all a selfish ploy for me to get you to educate me, but hopefully for the benefit of our listeners. So let me just begin here. What are some common ways that we as believers, we'll focus the conversation there, are formed when we're in the news cycle?
Okay. So if you've listened enough, you're going to know that I love to do the dialectic method, or at least my attempts. I've already talked a little bit about philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still learning how to employ dialectic method well, but when we're seeking to understand something well, we really have to start with definition.
Mm-hmm.
And even so far in our conversation, we've been talking about the news. We use it as a term as though we really fully understand what's going on. And it is deserving of splintering a little bit.
Okay.
So what is the news? What's the news?
Oh, gosh. Wow. I've never asked myself that question. Off the cuff, and we're going to need to refine this. I would say the news is anything that creates awareness of current events.
Sure.
That's kind of where I'm beginning.
Sure. I think that's a great place to start. So we're thinking current events. News is the record of current events. Could be a way that we rephrase it, right?
Okay.
Would you be okay with that?
Fully tracking with that.
So when we're talking about then current events, which by the way, you might hear the current of concurrently, that we're playing with words a little bit with our title. We're alongside current events.
I'm tracking with that. I like that.
All right. So the current of current events, it's the stuff that is going on right now, right?
Okay.
So it is a snapshot, maybe, of what's going on in our world. That could be something to continue to unpack this idea of current events. It's a snapshot. And I really appreciate the idea of snapshot when I think about that because, just like when you take a still, not one of those even those live photos that we can take on Apple products, they only give you just a little bit of a sense of the flavor of that person that we've tried to capture really quickly. But a snapshot, it's just a very brief instance, right? I think of it as then juxtaposed with, for example, historical record or biblical record or any number of things that expand the context for understanding. News is a very small portion of our lives and so deserving in order to really even understand it of just so many more dimensions. So when we ask about how is the news forming us or informing us, we need to think about what the current version of news is. It doesn't stay in its little tight space anymore like it did even about 20, 30 years ago. This snapshot, it seems like we're getting multiple, in the 24/7 news cycle. And so they're not coming across as that very brief look at what's going on in the world. It's coming across as though this is all there is, and that we need to develop our understanding of the world through just absorbing all of this content.
Yeah, almost like this idea that, and I'm kind of seeing this even subconsciously in me, that if I can consume enough of these snapshots, I can give myself the impression that I understand that which I really do not understand.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like that kind of forms me to be a person who thinks Well, I get what's going on because I've seen what would equate to 400 or 500 snapshots from the day. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
But the complexities are, those snapshots are really just snapshots, and they're not telling me a bigger picture. I'm often consuming snapshots of one particular thing. So maybe I read 2 or 3 news articles on the war in Ukraine, but I in no way, shape, or form even remotely approaching the complexities of that history that goes along with that, the motivations of the different peoples in the different parties, the depths of suffering that are going on, all these things. But I walk away feeling like I'm incredibly informed because I've consumed far more snapshots than I ever could in past human history.
Yes.
Is this kind of what you're tracking with?
That's exactly where I'm going. There's this illusion that the longer we look at the news or the deeper that we go, that we're going to discern, the heart of it, that we're going to look long and we're going to find truth.
And if we stop consuming, we'll miss out on truth.
Something's going to happen.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. This is the silliest thing in the world. There's this documentary regarding the Ukraine war, that one of these investigative news organizations had put out, and I had flagged it on my YouTube. And I was like, I want to watch that later and understand this piece of things a little better. It was like 20 minutes or whatever. And what ended up happening is I never watched it for like 3 weeks. And then when I went to go sit down and watch it, it had only been 3 weeks. I felt like it was already outdated.
Yeah.
And so I didn't even bother. And that stuck with me as this weird thing that what felt when I saved it to my watch later playlist, what felt like so important to understand now, because of just a few weeks, felt irrelevant. And I don't know, that was just a really weird kind of meta moment in my own consciousness to be like, Phil, what's going on here?
I love that you use the word meta. That's it. We really have to step outside and meta process in order to really go, wait a minute, what's going on with me? What's going on with what I'm believing right now, with how that is, flowing out into my action, the way that I engage. I need to think about my thinking for a minute. Think about what I'm doing, meta process.
I can hear the educator in this conversation. And this is so beautiful because, tell me, this is my impression, and I want your thoughts on this. I feel like the way that we consume news, and again, I don't think there was any maniacal, somebody twirling a mustache saying, "Ma, I'm going to, create this system." I just think there's a lot of things that led us to this point. But the point we've gotten to is I feel when I'm in the news that I have a big picture understanding. But what ends up actually happening is I'm getting sucked into these little moments, and I lack the ability to meta cognitively process, which we should probably quickly define, is the ability to think about the way you're thinking, or to understand why you're acting the ways that you're acting. So it's being able to have, cognitively like a out of body experience where you're kind of like, would you agree with that?
Not to be confused with Meta, the new name for Facebook and Instagram and all of its derivatives.
Please no.
Which that's interesting how some of those, this is just a side note, but interesting how some of those words are co-opted and lose their meaning. And so I just am going to put that little dig in again to just really defining terms well and reclaiming them for our own. So, let's return to original meaning. Yes, meta is that big picture. It's the thinking about our thinking. It's a stepping outside of all of our doing in order to re-engage with intention. So, yes. And I may have, I was just thinking about how so many words, when you use the word meta and you're seeking to define it, and I was thinking about how so many words have been redefined and are being used poorly. I definitely went down that track for a minute. So if I lost the sense of your question there, I apologize, but it is such an important part of engaging the news well, is the standing back, the thinking about our thinking, to even actually go, wait a minute, how am I using my words? How are they using their words? Would I agree? Do I, from a biblical perspective? And I'm going there immediately because there is now this new shade I'd like to get into, which has to do with the news makers. So we talked about what the news is, and we're defining news, and we're defining our thinking about how we're engaging and why. So many good questions, self-examination. But now I would also want to ask the question of the newsmakers. The reason why, because each person, whether they recognize it or not, they're going to be coming from a worldview perspective that influences their word choice. And we're in the postmodern age now, supposedly. But postmodernism is...
Where do we go from there? Do we go to
I don't know.
postmodern? Because if somebody ever, I'm gonna lose it. But continue on. Yes, but we are in the post, as some people are currently defining it.
Exactly. And I'm not even really sure how to define postmodern. So I'm going to go back to what I can define and still try to make some efforts to understand where are we now. But somehow where we are now is in that place where we have been defining our reality for ourselves, and that is quite often in the way that we claim words as our own, and we construct our reality through the words and even through their definitions that we might have tweaked. That's very much still in play, even if we're in the post, whatever we're in. So I would need a good philosopher to come instruct me. Yeah, do.
And what I'm going to ask is, because I think, I'm imagining someone listening to this. When you say that we've been defining reality for ourselves, what would be a good example of how that's being played out that we can kind of like latch onto to make that connection to the news?
I think one of my favorite examples to use, and that is spelled out in the news very clearly, and where you can see the difference of the news tellers, the storytellers, is in the case of abortion.
I was just thinking that same thing, because it is really obvious in the way they communicate.
Yes, I think that is one of the clearest examples. There are more, but the reason why that one's so clear for me is because it has a long history. Like when I was a child, thinking about pro-choice versus pro-life, that's very much a part of my own relationship with the news. And then being able to live as I saw the terms change, anti-abortion into... all of these, now we are using abortion not even so much as a term that is to be avoided anymore. We are talking about abortion rights. That's the newest version of the term.
Actually, I think it's iterated one more time from abortion rights to, I think oftentimes advocates for abortion rights would now just say reproductive rights. They're moving away from that term, even abortion.
Let me push back just a little bit on that.
You could push back a lot if you like.
I will.
Okay.
Let's do it now. That's the joy of the dialectic.
Yeah.
We're sharpening. It's the iron sharpening iron as we learn and we make observations. Reproductive rights has been something that's been a little bit more palatable to people because it has still cloaked the idea of taking the life of the unborn under the guise of reproduction rights. Now, it's still used everywhere.
Yeah.
But they're trying to, I'm saying those folks who are advocating for abortion are trying to make the term abortion more palatable by using it.
Yeah.
Like by making it a, claim your abortion, right? What's the other one? They talk about scream your abortion, or there are a number of different. It's seeking to make that which was heinous that which is common.
And I think just because our conversation is not focused on this topic exactly, but just to broaden, this is something that, in a sense, I hate terms like sides. This is frustrating, and this is where I feel like the news has formed me. I only can think in the context of sides. But the other side has moved from anti-abortion to pro-life. That's a pretty big transition they made, again, because pro is much more palatable than anti. And it's the power of words, which is where I think we're going with this, right? That in this topic, you can see how the discussion has been shaped and changed over time. And there's this consistent transition of terminology and of words in order to, and I think this is the point. You were kind of saying in order to shape or choose our reality. Maybe I'm getting that wrong just a little bit.
In order to be the one who's in control over the narrative.
Correct. Okay. Yeah.
And so again, whenever we think of narrative, we're talking about story and storytellers. Okay. So who's telling the story? And I would say again, and by the way, it's shout your abortion is the, it came to me as you were talking, but depending on who is telling the narrative, different terms are going to be used. And so pro-life has actually been around as long as I recall. And again, I'm middle-aged now. So this is a
keep using
good
that, Kelsey. 25 is not middle-aged. All right.
We won't have that discussion on air. But the narrative is going to be spun. You know, we talk about spin. It's going to be spun differently according to who the storyteller is. And pro-life has always been the term that is preferred by those who are for life. And anti-abortion has always been the term that has been preferred for those who are pro-choice.
Yeah. And so I am tracking with you that, when we're looking, and this is actually one of the reasons I've been so hesitant to talk about it on the podcast, right? Because who you have on to talk about the news is in and of itself a choice that you're making. And, wanting to keep the conversation focused on how we're formed by it, it's been hard to say, like, where do we step into this conversation? Because we are at a point where the news organizations we choose to listen to or read from, they're a part of our formation process. Whether we choose to follow one or multitudes is going to be a part of our formation process. Like, all of these are choices that we're making that are shaping who we are and how we're becoming more or less like Christ, because we're entering into these tough conversations that we're going to be thinking about and processing through. And if the words that we're constantly left with and that are lingering in our minds are words that are coming from voices that are making us less like Christ, I think my problem is, and I want to be just genuine, I'm a 90s Christian kid, and that brings some baggage from my childhood, right? That voices that claimed to be speaking from a Christian worldview, I had to go through a pretty rough, and I think many millennial Christians can agree with this, and they have varying levels of this. Maybe mine was not as extreme, but I had to go through a lot of relearning, unlearning, as it were. I did not deconstruct. I want to be clear, but I understand people who have used that term to describe their experiences. And for me, it was a lot of speaking that way about people we disagree with actually is antithetical to the gospel, and a lot of that kind of stuff. So what I'm trying to get at is there any, or should a Christian, I guess this is a question I've been wrestling with, because I don't follow Christian news organizations. I've chosen the path, right? I don't know if this is right or wrong, but just be transparent. I've chosen the path to just read broadly. You know what I mean? Just just read it all and hope that I kind of land in this weird centrist home.
Sure.
Is that the right path from your perspective? Is that not? I don't know.
The right.
Ooh, not that right.
Right. So yeah.
Oh gosh.
So I have read a lot of Tolkien in my life. And I wish to align myself with the elves when I say, the type of things. I'm not sure I can advise you on this.
That is the nerdiest and best quote we've ever had on the podcast.
I'm glad to be able to be nerdy, particularly if it's related to Tolkien. Oh my. But no, I can't even give myself those kind of props. I'm not that old. The elves are old. So, but just thinking about that question, it's very debatable. Put it in a yes or no. Yeah, you put it in yes or no terms. So it's a very debatable question.
If you wouldn't mind just coming down and telling me exactly what to think, Kelsey, that would be fantastic.
I'm going to have to go back to words as the way that they are representative of worldview. Words shape us. No matter what we do, words, they come out of worldview and they are going to form worldview. So if we're talking about formation, and if we're thinking of news as beyond information and realizing, as you've astutely done in your question, that news is something that actually forms us, the reason why it does that is because words are representative of worldview, and worldview forms us to our core. or it is a display of what we're truly believing at our core. As an educator, I'm going to say, we can think about something on the cognitive level, but the stuff that we really do and know is what we have pulled way down deep inside of us, that is informing the attitudes of our hearts. It's the belief level. And what we truly believe at our core is what informs our actions in the world most. And so let's go back to narrative. Let's go back to storytellers. Our worldview is the thing that shapes the story that we're telling. I would like to say, as I kind of argue out of the other side of my mouth, that reading broadly is extremely important, but it is best done from a place where you're fairly sure of what footing you have. That that there is truth with a capital T, that it's a truth for all men, that there is a good authority that has made his world out of, you can't make atoms fall together on a falsehood. You have to be the one who is the standard for all truth, all scientific truth, all theological truth, all everything, capital T, universal truth. If you have your feet on that footing, reading broadly is going to be something that helps to equip you for engaging broadly, right? For loving neighbor.
So, and I fully agree. And I want to rephrase and restate. So essentially it's this idea of like entering into the world with our mind by reading broadly can be a good and healthy thing when we've already established a firm foundation that is founded. I would just go back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, he gives us this example, and he's like, the person who does, I want to be clear, does what I say. That's what Jesus says.
Yes.
That person is building their house on a rock. And so essentially, if we're people who are, to the best of our very limited, broken understanding, trying to grasp truth from God's word and through prayer and through community, and then we're engaging in a life of service to all people, including those we would identify as our enemies, we're going to be in a place where we can probably interact with the thoughts of the world and become someone in and not of.
Yes.
I'll add one little thing that people have heard me talk about this. If you have been a long-time listener, we interviewed Caitlin Chess on the podcast, and I'm pointing towards my bookshelf because her book's up there somewhere. But her debut book was called The Liturgy of Politics. And one of the things I grasped from that book is we all are engaging in activities that are forming us. And we're never going to get out of a world in which that happens.
Right.
The maturity comes in the awareness of how it's forming us. So reading an article from Fox or CNN or wherever, it's impossible to consume the news without engaging with somebody else's worldview, some of which will agree, some of which we won't agree, some of which will agree with the Bible, some of which will not agree with the Bible.
Right.
Right. That's impossible. But what is possible is to enter in with awareness of that worldview, to maturely engage with the content in a way that does not necessarily form us away from Christ. Is this good advice?
I think you're spot on.
Whew. All right.
And the beauty is that it's a process, like that we don't have to perfect it. That
it's a slow work.
Footing. That's right. It is a slow work. It reminds me of a thought that I had when we were talking about our podcast. There is an interesting fact that we were originally encouraged to maybe drop episodes every day. And I was like, I don't think I can do that. I think that is way too quick turnaround for me.
Absolutely not, fam. That's how I would have been that.
So praise the Lord, by his good direction and grace, in part through my instincts and recognition of my own limitations, we ended up by default being on this slow cycle of digesting the news, in order to respond to it and not merely react to it, and not just be, trying to turn on a dime with commentary, immediately after news had broken or whatever the case may be. This is a very slow process. Learning should be that slow process so that it moves the 18 inches from head to heart and then flows out into action in the world that the Lord is sanctifying. And that's a process. We haven't obtained this already. We haven't been made perfect. We press on to take hold of that for which Christ has taken hold of us. But this is all of our lives in all of the world and everything that we do process. And that includes, our engagement of the world, our making forays into listening to its stories and stepping back and meta-processing, gaining further wisdom, leaning into Christ, leading into his word, which is right there. We have so much wisdom at our fingertips, and the Father, the Son, and the Spirit who surround and indwell. And so there's a lot of hope for taking it slow.
And it's a huge credit to you and to your organization for creating the space for that. I'm so glad we brought up taking it slow. I think one of the ways, and then I'd love to transition just a little bit in our conversation, but I think one of the ways that the news has formed a lot of us, and even those who I just really want to affirm that so many people went into the news as an industry out of a desire to serve, out of, there's so many people, even people I disagree with their worldview, even people who, I joke about it a lot because it's so important to remind us that very few people have entered into the world in a way that they say, I just can't wait to do harm. It's usually just, they're trying to do good absent of the gospel and the power of the Spirit, which was me for a good chunk of my life. So who am I to judge?
Amen. I hear that.
So, but I think it's important that the news, in an attempt to keep us all quote unquote informed, has created an environment in which we feel that immediate response is healthy, appropriate, mature. It's the way we engage. And it's often what leads to a level of sin in both our thoughts, actions, and responses. I've talked about this once on the podcast, but it feels important to share here. I was interviewing Dr. Randy Richards, who wrote the book Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes, which is a fantastic text. And actually, no, this was before the podcast. I wasn't interviewing him. He just came in and he was really nice. He stopped in on a book study that I was doing with a group of people to lead through his book. And it was like 2021, 2022. It was like kind of in that like COVID still thing, but like we don't really know what to do with the thing. So we're all going to be remote. But this is a totally an awkward time. Fantastic. Miss it. I don't. Anyways, but somebody in the group had asked a question like, how do you feel like the church handled the pandemic? And as the person who gotten the guest here, I was like starting to sweat, like, oh my gosh, like this is going to get controversial fast, because we had a mixed group of people politically and stuff.
Sure. That's great.
And he said something that reminds me of this moment. And I don't know why, but he said, I think that the church failed because we got caught up in all the wrong conversations and we let people die alone.
Yeah.
And for me, I was thinking masks, no masks, meet in church, don't meet in church. Like these were the topics that everyone talked about. But he was speaking as someone who had taken a step back, looked at the moment and looked at church history. And he was thinking about all the Christians who stayed in Rome and stayed with the dying. And he made a comment that maybe he was facetious, but I don't think so. He was like, if we needed to put hazmat suits on, we should have put hazmat suits on to sit next to the bed and hold the hand of the dying. And,
That's right.
it was this moment where I realized that I had been so insulated into this particular conversation. And I felt like, whoa, I think I was involved in a conversation Jesus wasn't emphasizing, that he had a greater desire to be with the suffering, and I'm his body and I should have been there. And I wasn't. And I think it's partly because I get caught up in this desire to respond, or react, I should say, react to the moment. And I don't take the time often to lean back and fast and pray and just say like, if nobody hears from Phil for the next 72 hours on this, the world probably won't burn, like it's going to be all right. And it was one of the reasons that we also created a podcast that was not current events focused, because we didn't think we could handle that conversation with faithfulness like you've been.
Well, that, praise the Lord, that's how it comes across. I mean, again, I was the reluctant news-related person. I'm the reluctant newsie. Education, the slow process, the wholesome practices, like you mentioned. I think part of it is because of the recognition of my own need. I'm sitting here rearing 3 daughters, and my limits are always before me.
Yeah.
And anytime that I do seek to engage from human strength, I fall flat on my face. But it is the ordinary, wholesome liturgies. We talked about that at the turn of the year, talking about liturgy and practice.
And literacy, right? It was liturgy and literacy.
And literacy,
it was great episodes,
those
by
two.
the way. Can't recommend them enough.
Thank you.
So good.
Well, my dear colleague, Amy Otten, she is just kindred spirit to my heart and mentor, really. She's a few years ahead of me and is such a mentor in this space of seeking faithful practices, ordinary work. People always, I even listened, to some commentary this morning on the COVID, that COVID was an extraordinary time and it required extraordinary measures. And I would argue, and did from the very beginning, our first episode was extraordinary times call for ordinary measures. Yeah. The work of discipleship looks very ordinary and often quiet and not very full of glory. If the Lord puts us into a place where we have a ton of listeners, it's going to be because of Him alone, not because this is something that we're seeking after, because I am so in love with the ordinary practices now.
I think so. You made a comment about rearing 3 young women, really, at this point.
Yes.
And I've got 4 boys. My oldest is 9, so I'll just call them boys.
That's so fun. That's got to be a household.
It is one of the greatest joys of my life. It really is. Like, oftentimes people are like, oh, it's funny. Like, I'll be walking through the store with all of them. Like, maybe I'll just take them all to Home Depot to look at power tools. Don't judge me. And
Yes.
somebody be like, oh, that's a handful. Or they make comments to my wife all the time, and I'm like, I don't think you understand. Like, these are my joy. Like, this is like, this is not a handful. This is a pleasure. But anyways,
that's right.
One of the reasons as well that I wanted to talk to you, and I'd love to transition, and maybe we even have to have a part 2 and talk more about this at some other time. But what are some, give me the Cliff Notes, Kelsey. How do I prepare my 9-year-old boy to enter into the news cycle? Because I'm terrified. Sure. And if I'm really honest, I keep him away from it right now. Like, we have overarching conversations about, we've talked about the war in Israel. We've talked about the war in Ukraine. We talk about civil unrest. We've talked about, we've had very high level conversations, but I have yet to engage really faithfully in sharing articles written for his age with him or those kind of things. And it's partly because I don't feel like I've had the wisdom to know how to navigate. So again, selfishly brought you here really just for my own means and things. And no, but in all seriousness, how do you get kids into the news cycle in a healthy way?
All right, I'm going to have to dive deep again, like as in dive back.
Okay,
deep.
All right.
So much of my own preparation for anything that I'm doing in life has been because my father and my mother had conversations with me and my siblings around the dinner table, after a movie, while they were reading books aloud, during our devotional time as parents, as our parents, them leading us in a family devotional time. When you are engaging, whether this is you, Phil, or any of us as parents, when we are engaging with our children in conversation, in relationship, that provides the most solid foundation that we could ever do. just forget about any other curriculum. Just you in relationship with your kids, having conversation with your kids is the most important thing. It is where we have the deepest learning is in relationship, in conversation. It's experiential. It's modeling. It's showing that we are learners too. It's pointing to something of the Father. Those are huge places in the lives of our kids. Obviously, we can turn to curriculum, but before we even do that, we have to start with relationship, with conversation.
Which is really biblical, as
Yes.
the Lord, Jesus kind of really introduces, in a sense, the language to his disciples of my Father, that
Yes.
Yahweh is Father, is parental, is loving, is intimate. And we talk, I think a lot of times the church does a pretty good job nowadays, I think, of generally talking about the fact that, we can't understand God through a list of facts, but it's through relationship and intimacy in that way.
That's right.
And I wholeheartedly agree. And taking that biblical principle and exporting it in a healthy way into the family means that the best thing I can give for my children is a deep, intimate relationship with me as their father and with my wife as their mother. And that as we take on that parental role to prepare them, it sounds like you're saying, to engage in the news and a plethora of other things. But for this conversation, begins with relationship.
Yes. Let me go back to this idea of the news. So my youngest is actually 9.
Oh,
I don't know if I ever, I don't know if I had told you that. So in between my middle daughter, who's 17, and my youngest, who's 9, we had graduate school. That's when my husband and I went to seminary.
Gotcha.
That's that place. And so our caboose came along after seminary days for us.
All right.
So when I first started...
I'm sorry, that's cute.
Yeah.
That's really cute. That's really cute.
So when I first started at God's World News specifically, which for the listener, that is our children's branch. Yep. It's the branch that was actually where we got our beginning as an enterprise. In 1981, we began with children's curriculum. So when I began there, my daughter suddenly had all of this new curriculum at her fingertips, and she's absorbing the things that I'm doing, and we're having conversations about it, and she's meeting my colleagues. And she turns to me one day and she said, "Mommy, the reason why we need to know about the news is because then we know what we're supposed to do in God's world." Now, she learned that because of being in a relationship with me. Yeah. Right? Because we were engaging this question of what does it look like for us to live faithfully? And she was seeing me, think about, is this what it means to be an educator? Is this where I need to be placed? Is this right for the family? All of these things. And so she, in her 9-year-old way, was drinking it in very seriously and needed the reference point, the place to bump her ideas off of. We were placed in relationship for that opportunity to explore this world and to be sharpened, iron sharpening iron, I say again, to be sharpened for the work that is ours in the world, for all the vocations that are myriad, for bringing glory to the Father through the way that we go out into his world to love it and to claim it for his own. The news is just a small portion of that. And I want to, maybe this is a good thought to end with for today. I want to return to that question about what it means to be formed by the news. I would argue that we are actually the ones who are forming. We're forming this world. The news gives us a snapshot of where our work needs to be in the world so that we are forming this world and being culture makers and maybe news makers, whether it makes the news or not, right?
Yes.
That we're doing the things that are newsworthy in the grand scheme and the good newsworthy. So those are just the things that are on my heart to begin to think about with you today?
The rapper and hip hop artist Propaganda has a series of albums that he's created, and it goes with his book Terraform. Ironically, I've got his coffee mug here for our.
There you go.
Anyways, but the theme is we are the culture. That as in this case, as we ourselves engage in the formative work of becoming like Christ, our children get an image of what that looks like and begin the process of following. And in what seems to the world as small and incremental, but was, I think, probably in the kingdom incredibly large, we form the culture in whatever ways God has ordained that he allows us to, as we become more like him. And so if we just focus in on becoming more like him, as usual, a lot of the little pieces fall into place.
That's right.
Kelsey, I'm so grateful, not just for you being here, but for the work that you are doing at World with the Concurrently podcast, for the resources you are putting out for parents. And we'll, of course, have links to all those things in the show notes below. But thank you and blessings to you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Phil.
Thank you so much for joining me and Kelsey on today's conversation. If you want to know more about the Concurrently podcast, and you absolutely should want to know more about the Concurrently podcast she hosts, check out the show notes below for a link to that. It's a fantastic podcast, and it has my total recommendation. Also, if you want to know more about us, check out thelivingroomdisciple.com for more information about who we are and how you can support us. Hey, shout out to Micah Pop, who is doing amazing work producing this episode, to Eric Church for getting this episode out into the world, and for Daniel Ramirez for the composition of today's music. And thank you to all of you for joining and being with us here on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.